So let's start. Welcome everyone to the second part of pregnancy-induced hypertension. In the first part, we got ourselves acquainted with the different types of hypertension which can take place associated with pregnancy. We saw the etiology, the risk factors, etiopathogenesis, the pathophysiology, as well as the complications of preeclampsia. In this part, mainly we're going to cover the management aspect of preeclampsia as well as eclampsia. Okay, so let's begin. Management of hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. So the basic management objectives include termination of pregnancy at an optimal time with least possible trauma to the mother and the fetus, birth of a healthy newborn that subsequently thrives, and complete maternal health restoration. Okay, so let's take a look at what pharmacological agents do we have at our predisposition for management of hypertension in pregnancy. So the antihypertensive drugs which are safe for use in pregnancy include first labetalol, which is an adrenoceptor blocker. It is an alpha plus non-selective beta blocker. So initiating dose is 100 to 400 milligrams twice daily. Maximum dose is 1200 milligrams per day. Maximum effect of labetalol therapy is seen within 2 to 4 hours, and the duration of action of the drug is 8 hours. Side effects include dizziness, fatigue, drowsiness, bradycardia. Okay, so in contrast to a number of other medications such as nifedipine or hydralazine, labetalol causes bradycardia, whereas the others are mostly associated with reflex tachycardia, as well as hepatotoxicity raised in the serum liver enzymes is seen in cases who are given labetalol treatment. Next, nifedipine, which is a calcium channel blocker. Initiating dose is 10 to 20 milligrams twice or thrice a day. Maximum dose is 180 milligrams per day. Onset of action. Okay, so there are two formulations when it comes to nifedipine. The immediate release formulation, which has a quick rapid onset of action, that is within 10 to 15 minutes it acts. Plasma half-life of the immediate release formulation is 4 to 7 hours. Whereas duration of action of the extended release formulation is 24 hours. So remember, nifedipine, if you're using the extended release formulation, once daily dosing is required. And the daily dose is equivalent to the total daily dose which you would use in the immediate release formulation. Side effects, since nifedipine is a vasodilator, it causes headaches, flushing, palpitations, or tachycardia, reflex tachycardia, and dizziness. Next, we have methyl dopa, which is very safe in pregnancy. Again, it is a centrally acting sympatholytic agent. It causes blockage of the alpha receptors present in the central nervous system. Methyl dopa, the initiating dose is 250 to 500 milligrams twice or thrice a day. Maximum dose 2 grams per day. Maximum effect of methyl dopa is slightly delayed, around 4 to 6 hours you will see the maximum effect. Duration of action is 10 to 12 hours. So methyl dopa is a mild antihypertensive agent. So in cases with moderate to severe hypertension, you might have to combine this specific drug with other antihypertensive agents like labetalol or nifedipine. Side effects include postural hypotension, headache, depression, and dryness of mouth. Antihypertensive agents for urgent control in pregnancy. Now, sometimes when the blood pressure is dangerously high and where you require a rapid but smooth control of blood pressure in pregnancy, the drugs which can be used for this purpose are labetalol, that is the intravenous or parenteral preparation, hydralazine, and nifedipine. Okay, so labetalol given intravenously, 20 milligrams IV over 1 to 2 minutes initially. Check the blood pressure after 5 minutes and 10 minutes. If the blood pressure is not controlled within 10 minutes, give a 40 milligrams IV dose. Still, if the blood pressure is not controlled after 10 minutes, then 80 mg every 10 minutes till a maximum total dose of 220 mg is achieved until blood pressure is effectively controlled. Okay, so maximum dose of 220 milligrams in this one single cycle can be used. More than this should not be used and it should be used only until BP is effectively controlled. It is considered as a preferred agent due to smooth and rapid fall in blood pressure. Okay, so as compared to hydralazine, labetalol has a very smooth action and a rapid fall in blood pressure. Hydralazine, on the other hand, has a very unpredictable response when it comes to patients with dangerously high blood pressure. Tachycardia, as I said, is less common in labetalol. In fact, it causes bradycardia, and there are very few adverse effects as compared to other medical agents used for hypertensive control. It is contraindicated in patients with asthma, heart disease, and congestive heart failure. Why? Because labetalol is an adrenoceptor blocker. So it can cause bronchoconstriction. It can cause further exacerbation of heart failures. Hydralazine, it is a vasodilator, specifically an arteriolar vasodilator. The dose is 5 to 10 milligrams intravenous, which is the initial dose, followed by 10 milligrams intravenous doses every 15 to 20 minutes till satisfactory response is achieved. Higher frequency of dosing or higher dose can lead to maternal hypotension and can even lead to uteroplacental insufficiency and fetal distress. So while giving hydralazine, you have to be very careful. You shouldn't increase the dose just because the maternal blood pressure is very high. This is the standard dose of hydralazine which should be used. Any increase in dose can suddenly cause a precipitous or acute fall in blood pressure and can cause uteroplacental insufficiency and fetal distress. Okay, so avoid using higher doses of hydralazine than are required. Other side effects include headaches, tachycardia, flushing, and ankle edema. Why? Because it is an arteriolar dilator. Nifedipine. Now here, for urgent control of blood pressure in pregnancy, the immediate release formulation of nifedipine should be used, not the extended release formulation. 10 milligrams or up to 20 milligrams orally, immediate release formulation to be given, followed in 20 to 30 minutes with 10 to 20 mg again if necessary. Okay. Comments, it can cause reflex tachycardia, flushing, headaches. Serious side effects when it is used with magnesium sulfate. I've explained this before also. Magnesium sulfate is also a calcium antagonist. Okay, just like nifedipine, which is a calcium channel blocker. Both of them can synergistically act to cause hypocalcemia, which can even lead to temporary muscle paralysis or even cardiac arrest. Okay, so you have to be very careful when you're using magnesium sulfate in a patient who is already taking nifedipine. A very important note, sublingual route of nifedipine is no longer recommended as it can cause a precipitous fall in blood pressure. So do not use sublingual route for administration of nifedipine. Patient can undergo sudden collapse because of sudden hypotension. Okay. Now, the WHO has a very strong recommendation with regards to starting antihypertensive treatment. So women with severe hypertension, that is blood pressure more than or equal to 160 by 110 during pregnancy, should receive treatment with antihypertensive drugs. Okay. However, the WHO has said that a consensus has not been reached regarding the management of preeclampsia without severe hypertension in the absence of comorbidities. So for patients in whom the blood pressure is less than 160 by 110, there has not been a consensus whether antihypertensive treatment should be started in these patients or not. There have been a number of studies which have shown the effects of starting antihypertensive treatment in patients with mild to moderate hypertension, and they have shown that there wasn't a significant improvement in the maternal or fetal outcome, but in fact there was actually a fall in the uteroplacental perfusion, giving rise to fetal growth restriction because of inadequate perfusion or placental blood flow because of starting antihypertensive treatment in mild to moderate hypertension. So a consensus has not been reached as with regards to the WHO. However, NICE guidelines number 133, which were formulated by the UK body in 2010, updated in 2019, they have said offer pharmacological treatment if blood pressure remains above 140 by 90 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so if the patient has a blood pressure persistently above 140/90 or any other maternal or fetal compromise, then yes, pharmacological treatment should be started. However, in all cases, avoid a sudden, rapid, acute fall in blood pressure. Okay, this can lead to sudden decrease in the uteroplacental flow and can cause fetal distress. Control of blood pressure, it should be rapid, yes, but smooth and steady. So just to illustrate this, I have a graph here adapted from Williams Obstetrics. So here in this patient, hydralazine was given at 5-minute intervals instead of 15-minute intervals. Okay, so the initial mean arterial pressure of the patient was around 180 millimeters of mercury. And because of increased frequency of hydralazine administration, there was a sudden rapid fall in the mean arterial pressure over a span of only 1 hour from 180 to 90 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so following this, there was an associated sudden fetal bradycardia. If you can see, there was a drop in the fetal heart rate. Following this, what was done? A rapid crystalloid infusion raised the mean arterial blood pressure to around 115 millimeters of mercury, and then the fetal heart recovered. Okay, so you have to be very careful, especially with hydralazine. The response of the patient cannot be very well predicted in this drug. Okay, so you have to be very careful that the control of blood pressure is not sudden. It is a smooth and steady, gradual control of blood pressure. Choice and route of administration of antihypertensive drugs for severe hypertension during pregnancy in preference to others. How should you decide which drug to give? It should be based primarily on the prescribing clinician's experience with that particular drug, its cost, and its local availability. Okay, so this is the WHO recommendation with respect to the choice and route of administration of antihypertensive drug. What do the NICE guidelines have to say regarding this? They have said offer labetalol as the first choice to treat hypertension in pregnant women with preeclampsia. Second choice, nifedipine for women in whom labetalol is not suitable. And third, methyl-dopa if labetalol or nifedipine both are not suitable. Okay, so base the choice on any pre-existing treatment, side effect profiles, risks including fetal effects, and the woman's preference. Okay, so that is how you select the choice of antihypertensive and the route of administration. Route of administration also depends upon the severity of hypertension. Coming to mild to moderate hypertension in patients with non-severe preeclampsia. Okay, so which means the blood pressure is less than 160/110, and there are no concomitant premonitory signs and symptoms or any renal or liver dysfunction. So non-severe preeclampsia, how do you manage the patients? Should you manage them on an OPD basis? Should they be admitted? So what does the antenatal surveillance in these patients look like? Inpatient management, not shown any particular benefit as compared to outpatient care. Patients can be advised reduced physical activity and blood pressure monitoring at home itself. Okay, so either if they have a BP apparatus, a digital BP apparatus at home, they can document the blood pressure at home itself, once in the morning, once in the evening, or they can go to any local hospital or clinic and have their blood pressure charted, or they can have a visiting nurse to do it for them. This BP chart should be brought along with the patient for every antenatal checkup, and you must go through her BP readings. What is the trend of her blood pressure? Are there any excessive fluctuations in her blood pressure? Adequate protein and calorie intake also should be emphasized. As you know, preeclampsia is a state of hypoproteinemia, so adequate protein intake in these patients must be advised. Frequent antenatal follow-ups, either weekly or two weekly, in order to detect signs and symptoms of worsening at the earliest. So whenever a patient comes to you for an antenatal follow-up, make sure her weight is monitored, her pulse, blood pressure, obstetrical examination, general examination, including pedal edema, proteinuria. All of this must be documented, compared with her previous readings. Ask her if she has any premonitory signs and symptoms. So basically, you need to detect the worsening of the patient at the earliest in case she requires admission. Okay. Offer pharmacological treatment if blood pressure remains above 140/90 as per the NICE guidelines. Patients are asked to follow up earlier than their follow-up date if any abnormal home BP readings are present or in the presence of any premonitory symptoms. So you must explain to the patient what these premonitory symptoms are. When should the patient come to you on a priority basis for a follow-up? So these include severe headaches, visual disturbances, which could be blurring of vision, photophobia, scotomas, epigastric pain or right upper quadrant pain, vomiting, sudden swelling of face, hands or feet. Okay, any of these are present, patient should come to you immediately. Hospitalization in these patients may be indicated in new onset hypertension, that is when the blood pressure is more than or equal to 140/90 for initial evaluation of the patient, okay? Or if there are any concerns for the well-being of the mother or fetus on your obstetrical examination, for example, if you feel that the liquor has reduced or if you feel that there is a fetal growth restriction, then you must admit the patient for further evaluation. So on admission, a complete history of the patient must be taken, including history of her previous pregnancy, detailed clinical evaluation, her pulse, blood pressure, proteinuria, obstetrical examination should be done. Blood pressure monitoring every 4 hourly. Quantification of proteinuria as a baseline evaluation is very important. This can be done either by 24-hour urine protein or urinary protein is to creatinine ratio. Investigations like hemogram, LFTs, RFTs, urine routine should be sent so that you have a baseline investigations of the patient. Evaluation of fetal well-being includes an ultrasound for fetal size, amniotic fluid, Doppler assessment, biophysical profile depending upon the gestational age, and non-stress test. Okay, so a baseline non-stress test in patients who are newly diagnosed should be done in cases of preeclampsia. Repeat ultrasound for fetal assessment every 2 weekly if the scans are normal, and NST should be repeated as clinically indicated. Okay. Next, coming to management of severe preeclampsia. Now, severe preeclampsia patients have to be managed indoors. Admit the patient, start antihypertensive treatment in cases of severe hypertension, that is blood pressure more than or equal to 160/110. Maternal clinical assessment should include monitoring of blood pressure every 15 to 30 minutes until BP is less than 160/110. And then following this, at least 4 times daily, if not more frequently. Blood investigations, complete hemogram, LFTs, RFTs, including uric acid and creatinine. Fundus examination should be done in patients with severe preeclampsia to find out for retinal involvement, arteriolar constrictions, microinfarcts, papilledema in cases of malignant hypertension with raised intracranial tension. So fundus examination also should be done. Fetal assessment, the obstetric examination, ultrasound, NST. Magnesium sulfate should be considered in cases with severe preeclampsia. We'll be looking at magnesium sulfate in detail. Consider pregnancy termination depending on the gestational age and severity of the disease. So basically, timing the delivery in these patients depends upon severity of the disease and gestational age. Okay, it is a balance between the maternal risk and the fetal risk. The balance cannot tip on any particular side. Okay, expectant management in patients with severe preeclampsia should be done only if it will significantly improve the fetal outcome and not if it's going to increase the maternal risk. Okay, for example, in cases of severe preeclampsia, when the gestational age is still in the pre-viable period, there is no point in continuing the pregnancy because you're not going to improve the fetal outcome to a very large extent. In fact, you are compromising the maternal condition by unnecessarily prolonging the pregnancy. So therefore, making the right decision at the right time is where the art of medicine lies. So here, in timing of delivery is where your clinical acumen comes in. Okay, so timing of delivery in cases of non-severe preeclampsia, before 34 weeks of gestation, continue surveillance of the mother as well as the fetus, unless, of course, there are indications for early delivery. Now, these could be obstetric indications. These could be indications suggestive of severe preeclampsia, in which case, again, you'll have to end the pregnancy. Offer intravenous magnesium sulfate, that is for neuroprotection of the baby, and a course of antenatal corticosteroids for pulmonary maturation as per recommendations in case early delivery before 34 weeks is indicated. Okay, until then you can continue maternal and fetal surveillance. That is expectant management. From 34 weeks to 36 weeks, 6 days. Again, continue surveillance, maternal and fetal, unless there are indications for early delivery. In cases of non-severe preeclampsia, course of antenatal corticosteroids should be given up to 37 weeks of gestation as per the NICE guidelines. And 37 weeks onwards, initiate birth within 24 to 48 hours. There's no point in prolonging the pregnancy after 37 weeks because it's not going to significantly affect the fetal outcome, but it will just increase the maternal risk. Indications for delivery include uncontrolled hypertension despite using 3 or more classes of antihypertensive agents in appropriate doses, maternal pulse oximetry less than 90%, progressive deterioration in the liver function tests or the renal function tests, hemolysis, that is raised LDH, or decreasing platelet count. Ongoing neurological features such as severe intractable headaches or persistent headaches, repeated visual scotoma, or even eclampsia calls for immediate expedition of delivery. Placental abruption, again another indication for facilitating delivery, and reversed end diastolic flow in the umbilical artery Doppler velocimetry also is an indication for stopping the conservative management and going in for a delivery. A non-reassuring cardiotocograph or stillbirths, again indication for delivery. Now, timing of delivery in severe preeclampsia, less than 24 weeks, that is whenever the baby is in a pre-viable stage, stabilize the patient and terminate the pregnancy. There is no point in prolonging the pregnancy at maternal cost when the fetal prognosis is not going to be improved at a proportionate rate. 25 to 33 weeks. Now this again, 25 to 33 weeks gestational age group. Again, the management depends upon your NICU facilities, and the decision should be a combined decision between, after a discussion between the obstetrician, the neonatologist or pediatrician, and the patient and relatives. Okay. Expectant management can be considered with intense maternal and fetal monitoring, but timely intervention should be done in case there is increasing maternal risk. Okay. There should be again a good balance between the maternal and fetal prognosis. Corticosteroids for fetal lung maturity, magnesium sulfate in cases of severe preeclampsia, not only for as a prophylaxis for eclampsia, but before 32, 33 weeks, it also serves as a neuroprotective agent for the fetus. More than 34 weeks of gestation, severe preeclampsia, stabilize the patient with strict fetal surveillance and deliver. Ultimately, the final definitive management of severe preeclampsia is delivery. Okay. Now, this is a clinical management algorithm for severe preeclampsia at less than 34 weeks. So just a quick recapitulation of what I just explained. Admit the patient to the labor room, maternal and fetal assessment, including the maternal baseline blood tests, clinical examinations. Consider magnesium sulfate in cases of severe preeclampsia. Treat severe hypertension if blood pressure is more than or equal to 160 by 110. Now you have to decide whether you want to conserve the patient or you want to deliver the patient. Contraindications, however, to conservative management include persistent symptoms, that is severe headaches, epigastric pain, vomiting, or severe hypertension despite antihypertensive treatment if the hypertension persists, eclampsia, pulmonary edema, HELLP syndrome, significant renal dysfunction, coagulopathy, abruption, pre-viable fetus, fetal compromise, fetal distress. Any of these contraindications are present, you will deliver the fetus immediately. Okay. If these contraindications are absent, you can use an expectant management approach. Initially, it will be a 24 to 48 hour observation. And in this period, you will also give corticosteroids for lung maturation. Frequent evaluation, however, of both the mother as well as the fetus is very important in cases of severe preeclampsia where you have decided on an expectant management. Okay, so vital parameters should be measured every day. Urine output should be measured. Daily lab evaluation for HELLP syndrome. Daily fetal assessment with serial sonographies and cardiotocography. Any of the contraindications which we just saw, if they develop during the course of your expectant management, you will deliver the mother. If not, ongoing inpatient management can be continued. Again, for ongoing inpatient management, daily maternal assessment, strict monitoring of the patient is very important. Serial lab evaluation of renal function for HELLP syndrome should be done, and daily fetal assessment, evaluation of serial growth, Doppler studies, cardiotocography, amniotic fluid volume, all of this should be done. If you can pull the patient up to 34 weeks, well and good, deliver the patient at 34 weeks. If any of these contraindications which we just saw develop before that, during your inpatient expectant management, delivery is indicated. Timing of delivery, now with respect to gestational hypertension and chronic hypertension, do not offer delivery before 37 weeks, provided the blood pressure is less than 160 by 110 millimeters of mercury and no other indications of delivery are present. So you can conserve the patient up to 37 weeks of gestation. There is no indication for delivery provided the blood pressure is controlled. Corticosteroids, if early birth is considered likely, within 7 days in women with preeclampsia, offer a course of antenatal corticosteroids for deliveries before 37 weeks of gestation. So up to 37 weeks of gestation, if you're expecting a delivery, then a course of antenatal corticosteroids for pulmonary maturation should be administered. Now the NICE guidelines for fetal monitoring in patients with chronic hypertension, gestational hypertension, preeclampsia and severe gestational hypertension. There are two modalities for monitoring the fetus. One is an ultrasound for fetal growth, amniotic fluid assessment, umbilical artery Doppler. And second is the NST or cardiotocography. So in cases with chronic hypertension, routinely ultrasound should be done at 28 weeks, 32 weeks and 36 weeks. More frequently if clinically indicated or if there are any abnormalities in the previous sonographies. Gestational hypertension, ultrasound should be done at diagnosis, definitely. And if it is normal, repeated every 2 to 4 weeks as clinically indicated. Preeclampsia and severe gestational hypertension, again, ultrasound should be done definitely at diagnosis and every 2 weeks thereafter. Subsequent monitoring also depends upon the scan results and the clinical condition of the patient. Okay, so accordingly, as clinically indicated, you can increase the frequency of your sonography. Cardiotocography or an NST, it should be done in chronic hypertension and gestational hypertension only if clinically indicated, not on a routine basis. Preeclampsia or severe gestational hypertension, CTG should be done in all patients at diagnosis. Should be repeated only if decreased fetal movements are present, vaginal bleeding, abdominal pain, or there is a deterioration in the maternal condition. Okay, so these are the conditions in which you will repeat the cardiotocography. Now, fetal monitoring in high-risk patients. Now, by high-risk patients, I mean patients who have had severe preeclampsia in a previous pregnancy. Okay, or preeclampsia that resulted in birth before 34 weeks in a prior pregnancy, preeclampsia with a baby whose birth weight was less than the 10th centile in a prior pregnancy, or previous history of IUD, intrauterine death, or placental abruption. Now, in these patients who have a history of these high risk factors, carry out an ultrasound for fetal growth, amniotic fluid volume assessment, umbilical artery Doppler velocimetry starting between 28 and 30 weeks of gestation, or at least 2 weeks before previous gestational age of onset of preeclampsia if it was before 28 weeks of gestation. So if in previous pregnancy, for example, onset of preeclampsia was at 25 weeks of gestation, this ultrasound monitoring in the present pregnancy, you will start at around 23 to 24 weeks of gestation. Okay, and it should be repeated every 4 weeks or even more frequently as clinically indicated. Intrapartum care, High-risk pregnancy should be explained to the patient and relatives, and high-risk consent should be obtained on admission. This is very important. Patient and relatives must be made aware of the severity of the disease and what is the maternal and fetal prognosis and outcome which is expected. Okay, this especially in preterm patients should be done along with someone who is in charge of the NICU or a pediatrician or a neonatologist. Okay, blood investigations and blood group cross matching should be done on admission to the labor ward, repeated as clinically indicated. Strict intrapartum monitoring during labor is very important. So a general examination, the pulse, blood pressure, vital parameters, premonitory signs and symptoms of the patient also very important. Knee jerks should be checked on each examination. Proteinuria should be assessed. Urine output should be charted. Fetal heart monitoring, every half-hourly intermittent auscultation along with 1 to 2 hourly cardiotocography should be done in patients with non-severe preeclampsia or mild to moderate hypertension. Okay. However, a continuous CTG is indicated in patients with severe preeclampsia, especially in the presence of fetal growth restriction. Okay. So depending upon the facilities available, fetal heart monitoring should be done. And monitoring of labor progression with a partograph, with your clinical examination, assessing for uterine activity, per vaginum dilatation of the cervix, all this should be charted and progression of labor should be monitored. BP monitored at least 1 hourly intrapartum in cases of mild to moderate hypertension and every 15 to 30 minutes until it is less than 160 by 110. Continue antihypertensive during labor. Do not withhold antihypertensive agents. Avoid aggressive fluid administration in cases of severe preeclampsia. As I had discussed in the last lecture, this can lead to pulmonary edema. So avoid overzealous hydration of the patient. The drip should be maintained somewhere between 60 to 125 milliliters per hour. Limiting the duration of second stage of labor or cutting short the second stage of labor by operative or assisted vaginal delivery is indicated in severe hypertension, not controlled by initial antihypertensive agents, not in all patients of mild to moderate preeclampsia. Active management of third stage of labor should be undertaken in all patients. Avoid methyl ergometrin, very important, ergot derivatives as uterotonic agents for third stage management because this can lead to dangerous hypertension in these patients. Higher risk of postpartum hemorrhage in these patients, even with small amounts of blood loss. This is mainly because of the contraction of intravascular circulating blood volume and hemoconcentration. Okay, so they are very sensitive to postpartum hemorrhage with even small amounts of blood loss. The blood pressure may immediately fall after delivery to normal levels, which is mostly due to rapid blood loss. Okay, so whenever in patients of severe preeclampsia, after delivery, the blood pressure suddenly normalizes. It is not due to resolution of preeclampsia, but you must be mindful of the fact that this normalization of blood pressure could be due to rapid or excessive blood loss taking place after delivery. And such patients should be managed by judicious use of fluids and blood products. Okay. Mode of delivery. Now, whether cesarean is preferred or vaginal delivery is preferred, not only does it depend upon the gestational age, it also depends upon the favorability of the cervix as well as the severity of the disease. But all in all, the preferred mode of delivery for preeclampsia is vaginal delivery. Okay, it is associated with lesser complications as compared to cesarean sections. Cesarean section may be necessary for obstetrical indications like fetal distress, malpresentations, and abruption. If vaginal delivery, however, is not achieved in a reasonable amount of time from decision to induce, or if the condition of the mother deteriorates, then cesarean section becomes necessary. Severe preeclampsia in preterm patients, okay, with unfavorable cervix, sometimes in the first place you may take a decision for cesarean section due to higher chances of prolonged and unsuccessful induction and maternal and fetal compromise following unsuccessful induction in these patients. Next part of the lecture is mostly about eclampsia. So let's begin with the definition of eclampsia. It is the development of seizures that cannot be attributed to any other causes and or unexplained coma during pregnancy or puerperium in a woman with preeclampsia. Okay. Incidence of eclampsia, there's a wide variation in the incidence depending upon whether it is a developed country, developing country, what are the antepartum facilities available, how much is the care given during the antepartum period to women. So the incidence varies from 1:100 to 1:2000 deliveries. Average incidence in India is around 1.5% of all deliveries. Okay, eclampsia is most common in the third trimester and increasingly more frequent as term approaches. Eclampsia mostly takes place before or shortly after onset of labor, and once this happens, there is a rapid progression to delivery. Antepartum eclampsia incidence is around 38 to 53%, intrapartum eclampsia 18 to 36%, postpartum eclampsia 11 to 44%. Clinical features of eclampsia. So eclampsia is characterized by generalized tonic-clonic convulsions. Okay, it may start with premonitory slight twitching of the face or limbs, followed by a generalized tonic-clonic stages and post-ictal state or coma of varying duration. Okay, that depends upon the number of seizures and how recurrent are they. It could be a single episode or recurrent episodes at irregular intervals. But when seizures take place in rapid succession without recovery of the patient in between the seizures, or one single seizure continues unabated for more than 5 minutes also, it is called as status eclampticus and it can cause dangerous anoxic encephalopathy in these patients. So in such patients, sometimes deep sedation or general anesthesia is required. Recurrent seizures are dangerous. They can lead to cyanosis, tachycardia, anoxic encephalopathy, which can cause deepening of coma, pulmonary edema due to severe hypertension associated with eclampsia, and even death. Okay, especially if it is associated with other complications like cerebral hemorrhages. Remember, all pregnant women with convulsions should be considered to have eclampsia unless proved otherwise. Okay, so unless a patient has a previous history of epilepsy or any other previous predisposing conditions, and unless you can prove that, unless it has been diagnosed, all women who are pregnant and have convulsions, they should be considered to have eclampsia. Tongue bite is another dangerous clinical feature of eclampsia, and it can lead to torrential bleeding, which may even require blood transfusion. It could be that massive. It is due to forceful muscular movements of the jaw. Increased respiratory rate after the episode, which may even reach 50 per minute, is due to hypercarbia, lactic acidemia, transient hypoxia. High fever in these patients is a grave sign. It may suggest cerebrovascular hemorrhages. Okay, so this needs to be diagnosed. It can also lead to focal neurological deficits. Almost always eclampsia is associated with hypertension and proteinuria. Almost always, not in each and every case. Rarely there are cases which are normotensive or with mild to moderate hypertension which can have eclamptic seizures. And sometimes it can be associated in patients without proteinuria. Facial and peripheral edema is often pronounced in most of the patients. In majority cases, one or more premonitory symptoms are present, but convulsions can take place suddenly without warning. So premonitory symptoms, when they are present, they provide a high positive predictive value for occurrence of seizures or eclampsia. Okay, but absence of premonitory symptoms does not mean that the patient will not convulse. There could still be occurrence of eclampsia even without presence of premonitory symptoms. Fetal bradycardia often follows a seizure, which usually recovers within 2 to 10 minutes. Persistent fetal bradycardia, which continues even after 10 minutes of cessation of the seizure, can be attributed to other causes like placental abruption or even imminent delivery for that matter. Pulmonary edema. Causes of pulmonary edema, one is aspiration pneumonitis, which occurs during a convulsion or when the patient is under deep sedation or anesthesia, general anesthesia. Ventricular failure due to excessive or severe blood pressure, which can cause left-sided heart failure. Ventricular failure can also be due to aggressive fluid transfusion or infusion in patients with severe preeclampsia. And it is very common in patients with long-standing chronic hypertension or in morbidly obese patients. Blindness, we had seen last time, blindness, there are a number of causes for blindness in these patients. In eclampsia specifically, the cause is occipital lobe edema. Okay, it is a reversible form of blindness, which generally reverses within a few hours to maybe 1 to 2 weeks, but it is reversible. Pertschar's retinopathy, serous retinal detachment. These causes of blindness are mainly seen in patients with preeclampsia, which are not generally complicated by eclampsia. Post-eclampsia psychosis, again, this lasts for several days to 2 weeks. Antipsychotic agents may be used during this period. Prognosis for return to normal function is good. Press syndrome, posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Again, we had seen this last time. It is a leukoencephalopathy affecting the posterior part of the brain. Okay, it affects the white matter of the brain, especially in the occipital lobe, as well as the posterior part of the parietal lobes. This again has a good prognosis for return to normal function. It is a reversible encephalopathy. Transtentorial herniation due to massive long-standing cerebral edema, raised intracranial tension can result in death. This generally takes place in patients with recurrent seizures, status eclampticus. Other diagnoses should be excluded if convulsions occur after 48 hours postpartum, if there are presence of focal neurological deficits or prolonged coma. So focal neurological deficits and prolonged coma in a patient with convulsions, you should also rule out other causes like cerebral hemorrhage, which can be seen in patients with long-standing chronic hypertension in the presence of Charcot-Gounod's aneurysms, which are generally present on the lenticular striate branches of the middle cerebral artery. So whenever there is a sudden acute rise in blood pressure, these aneurysms give way, giving rise to a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Okay, now this can lead to focal neurological deficits. This is one of the examples. And other causes, which are the general causes like encephalitis or any other seizure disorders, brain tumors, neurocysticercosis, all of this should be excluded whenever you come across a patient with atypical eclampsia. Complications of eclampsia. Now, maternal injury, as we have seen, tongue bite, head injury in case of fall of the patient, placental abruption, aspiration pneumonia, pulmonary edema, status eclampticus, cerebral hemorrhages, that is rupture of Charcot-Bouchard's aneurysms, acute kidney injury, coma, maternal death. And fetal complications include fetal distress, fetal hypoxia, asphyxia because of lactic acidemia and persistent hypoxia in the patient. Fetal demise can take place. Preterm births, which could be iatrogenic, they could be spontaneous. Increased perinatal morbidity and mortality. Management of eclampsia. Now I'm going to divide this into 5 important points. First step, clearing the airway, taking care of the circulation, airway and breathing. Control of the seizures using magnesium sulfate. Control of blood pressure by judicious use of antihypertensive medications for urgent control of severe hypertension, which we have already seen. And delivery of the baby, which is the definitive management of eclampsia. Postpartum monitoring, which forms or completes the management of eclampsia. Okay. So let's take a look. First, in a patient who is undergoing a convulsion, prevent tongue bite, trauma, and secure an airway. So lateral position of the patient should be given to prevent aspiration and to prevent falling back of the tongue, which will obstruct the airway. Suction out the vomitus as well as secretions. Mouth gag should be inserted immediately to prevent a tongue bite. Raise the bed rails in order to prevent fall if they are present, or support the patient from either side. Airway should be inserted in order to maintain a good oxygenation of the patient. Administer oxygen at 8 to 10 liters per minute. Monitor the vital parameters, saturation of the patient, maintain a good input-output chart. Secure an IV access, catheterize the bladder, very important. Again, not only for the output, but also to see if there is any frank evidence of hemoglobinuria. Send blood investigations which should include a complete hemogram, LFTs, RFTs, but it should also include arterial blood gas analysis, blood grouping cross-matching of the patient, and a baseline coagulation studies. Magnesium sulfate administration should be done. Antihypertensive agents to control blood pressure whenever it is more than or equal to 160 by 110. So you can use labetalol, hydralazine, nifedipine. Nifedipine less likely because it is an oral formulation. Parenteral administration of labetalol or hydralazine should be used. Again, very important, patient should be in a quiet room, minimize all the extraneous stimuli which may provoke a convulsion. Suction apparatus and oxygen should be available at the bedside. An emergency tray in case emergency tracheal intubation is required should also be made available at the bedside. Monitor the pulse, blood pressure, saturation, fetal heart of the patient. If the patient is on magnesium sulfate, you should specifically take care and monitor the respiratory rate, patellar reflex, and the urinary output. All this should be monitored at least half-hourly, if not more frequently, in all patients of eclampsia. Definitive management of eclampsia is delivery, irrespective of the gestational age, within approximately 12 hours. After stabilizing the patient, perform a per vaginum examination. Depending upon your PV findings, you will decide what mode of delivery you want to undertake. So if cervix is favorable, labor can be induced either with prostaglandins, oxytocin, amniotomy, depending on what your PV findings are. If cervix is unfavorable and fetus is alive and viable, cesarean section should be performed. Persistent fetal bradycardia or fetal distress lasting more than 10 minutes after eclamptic convulsion, cesarean section should be performed in fetal interest if delivery is not imminent. Okay. Now, coming to the very important drug for severe preeclampsia and eclampsia, that is magnesium sulfate. It is a drug of choice for prevention as well as treatment of eclampsia. It is an anticonvulsant agent. It is a neuroprotective agent which avoids producing CNS depression. So as compared to other anticonvulsant agents, it does not cause maternal sedation or CNS depression. Magnesium sulfate is not given to treat hypertension. So remember, it is not an anti-hypertensive agent. It lowers the mean arterial pressure, yes. It also increases the cardiac index transiently after initial administration, but this effect lasts only transiently, that is around 15 minutes, despite continuous infusion. So as per the MAGPIE trial, that is magnesium sulfate trial for prevention of eclampsia in pregnancy, which was conducted in 2002. It was the largest comparative study involving 10,000 women with severe preeclampsia from 33 countries. Magnesium sulfate was compared with placebo, and the results showed that those patients of severe preeclampsia given magnesium sulfate had 58% lower risk of eclampsia as compared to those given placebo. Mechanism of action of magnesium sulfate, as I said, it acts on the cortex. Okay, it is an anticonvulsant and neuroprotective agent. Inhibition of acetylcholine release from the neuromuscular end plate. Reduced presynaptic release of neurotransmitter glutamate. Blockade of the NMDA receptors. Improved calcium buffering by mitochondria. Blockage of the calcium entry via voltage gated channels. So all this is how magnesium sulfate acts in order to prevent recurrent triggering of action potentials and preventing a convulsion. Regimen. Now there are two regimens for magnesium sulfate. One is the intramuscular regimen called the Pritchard's regimen. The loading dose for this regimen, the total loading dose is 14 grams, of which 4 grams is given intravenously as a 20% solution. I'm going to tell you how to make this 20% solution. This 4 grams should be given over 3 to 5 minutes, that is slowly, followed by the remaining 10 grams. Now the remaining 10 grams are to be given deep intramuscular as a 50% solution. That is how the magnesium sulfate vials are available, ampules are available as a 50% solution. So 5 grams to be given in each buttock. Okay. Maintenance dose is 5 grams deep intramuscular every 4 hourly in alternate buttocks. The intravenous regimen, that is the Zuspan or Cibai regimen, The loading dose here is 4 to 6 grams intravenous in 100 ml of IV fluid to be given over 15 to 20 minutes. So this is a 50% solution. And maintenance dose is around 1 to 2 grams per hour IV infusion. Magnesium sulfate deep intramuscular administration in the upper outer quadrant of the buttock should be done under strict aseptic conditions in order to prevent gluteal abscess formation. So make sure you're cleaning the surface with either spirit, povidone iodine, use sterile gloves, and only then administer magnesium sulfate under strict aseptic conditions. Now, to make a 20% solution for Pritchard's regimen, 4 grams magnesium sulfate, which is a 50% solution available. So what does this 50% solution mean? It means 50% weight by volume, that is 50 grams in 100 ml. So 4 grams of magnesium sulfate will be available in 8 ml of magnesium sulfate vial. So this 8 ml, which is equivalent to 4 grams, should be taken in a 20 ml syringe. So once you take 4 grams in a 20 ml syringe, 8 ml of it will be occupied. Remaining 12 ml of the syringe should be filled with normal saline. So now what you have, the resulting solution will have 4 grams magnesium sulfate in 20 ml of solution. That is 4 divided by 20 expressed as a percentage, 20% weight by volume solution. Okay, so that is how you dilute the 4 grams to make it a 20% solution. So as we saw, continuous intravenous infusion, 4 to 6 grams loading dose to be given in 100 ml of IV fluid over 15 to 20 minutes. You can either begin the maintenance infusion at 2 grams per hour or at 1 gram per hour. For patients with BMI more than or equal to 30, even 2 grams per hour is helpful. Monitor for magnesium toxicity. So very important, 3 important things you will see other than the blood pressure is the patellar reflex or the deep tendon reflexes, respiratory rate, and the urinary output. Some measure serum magnesium levels at 4 to 6 hours routinely, but remember, routine measurement of serum magnesium levels is not required in patients who have a normal glomerular filtration rate or a normal kidney function. Okay, and adjustment of infusion is done to maintain levels between 4 to 7 milliequivalents per liter. So this is the therapeutic range of magnesium sulfate which is required to be present in the body. Measure serum magnesium levels if serum creatinine is more than or equal to 1 milligrams per deciliter. So it is very important to find out serum creatinine levels before starting magnesium sulfate drip, because magnesium excretion is entirely renal. In case of any renal compromise, renal dysfunction, or when the serum creatinine is more than 1, then in such cases, you will have to monitor the serum magnesium levels and try to maintain it between 4 to 7. Otherwise, these patients are at a higher risk of magnesium toxicity. Magnesium sulfate is discontinued 24 hours after delivery or 24 hours after the last convulsion, whichever comes later. Intermittent intramuscular injections. Now we saw this 4 grams of magnesium sulfate to be given as a 20% solution, which you know now how to make intravenously at a rate not to exceed 1 gram per minute. So around 4 to 5 minutes, you will give the IV injection. Follow promptly with 10 grams of 50% magnesium sulfate solution, that is 1/2 injected deeply in the upper outer quadrant of each buttock through a 3-inch long 20 gauge needle. You can also add 1 ml of 2% lignocaine in order to minimize the discomfort. If convulsions persist after 15 minutes, you will have to repeat the dose of magnesium, but this time you will give only 2 grams intravenously as a 20% solution at the rate of 1 gram per minute, so over 2 to 3 minutes. If the woman is large, BMI is more than or equal to 30, even 4 grams may be given IV slowly. Every 4 hours thereafter, this is the maintenance dose, 5 grams of 50% solution to be injected on alternate buttocks, but only after ensuring that the patellar reflex is present, respirations are not depressed, that is respiratory rate is never below 12 per minute, urine output the previous 4 hours should exceed 100 ml. So the urine output hourly should be at least 30 ml per hour. Magnesium sulfate is discontinued 24 hours after delivery or 24 hours after the last convulsion, whichever is later. Now, magnesium levels and effects. So as I said, therapeutic levels of magnesium are around 4 to 7 milliequivalents per liter. That is 1.8 to 3 millimoles per liter. At 10 milliequivalents per liter, there is a loss of patellar reflex. So that is why it is very important to monitor the patellar reflex. It is a sign of impending toxicity, because after 10 milliequivalents per liter, there is a progressive respiratory depression. And when the levels reach more than or equal to 12 milliequivalents per liter, there is a respiratory paralysis or respiratory arrest. Okay. More than 7.5 millimoles per liter, cardiac conduction alterations take place, and ultimately cardiac arrest will take place when there is hypermagnesemia at levels of more than 12.5 millimoles per liter. In case the patient does develop signs of toxicity, what will you do? Infusion should be discontinued, oxygen should be administered, and magnesium levels should be obtained. Okay. Now, depending upon these magnesium levels, if they are within the toxic range or if respiratory arrest takes place, then immediately administer calcium gluconate. 1 gram is the dose, 10 ml of 10% solution, IV slowly over 10 minutes is to be given. Okay. Assisted ventilation may be required in patients with respiratory paralysis using a bag and mask or mechanical ventilation, anesthetic apparatus, or even tracheal intubation. Calcium chloride can also be used. If calcium gluconate is not available, dose is the same, 1 gram. Magnesium excretion, as I said, is entirely renal. Okay, so in renal, in impaired renal function, monitoring of serum magnesium levels and adjustment of magnesium sulfate dose is required. Now, this adjustment is not to be done in the loading dose. Initial loading dose can be administered in all patients regardless of renal function, but maintenance rate needs alteration in cases with decreased glomerular filtration rate. So it is the maintenance rate which you will alter. Initial loading dose will help you in reaching that therapeutic level of magnesium. So that should not be altered. The maintenance rate should be altered because that is only to maintain the steady state concentration of magnesium in the body. Okay, so as per the magnesium levels, you can alter the maintenance rate. Coming to the last part of the lecture, that is your postnatal management of the patient. So in the postnatal period, let's see how do we alter the doses of antihypertensive medications. For women with hypertension in the postnatal period, if blood pressure is not controlled with a single medicine, consider a combination of calcium channel blockers. So you can either give nifedipine or amlodipine, beta blockers, that is atenolol or labetalol, and ACE inhibitors, that is enalapril. Okay, so varying combination of drugs from different groups. In women with preeclampsia who did not take antihypertensive treatment and have given birth, start antihypertensive treatment if blood pressure is 150 by 100 or higher. So these are all the nice guidelines which I'm stating. Consider reducing antihypertensive treatment if the blood pressure falls below 140 by 90, and definitely reduce it if it is below 130 by 80. Do not abruptly stop antihypertensive medications, otherwise it will lead to rebound hypertension. They need to be tapered off gradually. The blood pressure normalizes within a few days to up to 2 weeks in cases of preeclampsia in postpartum period. Persistently raised blood pressure is generally due to underlying chronic hypertensive diseases, for example, chronic kidney disease or chronic hypertension. All women who remain on antihypertensive agents should have a medical review at 2 weeks, okay, for alteration of the doses, for measurement of proteinuria, for measurement of blood pressure. And all women, irrespective of antihypertensive treatment, should be reviewed at 6 to 8 weeks. At 6 to 8 weeks, also a urinary protein dipstick test should be done. Persistent proteinuria present even at 6 to 8 weeks of gestation of postpartum period, then in such patients, At 3 months, renal assessment using either a ultrasound KUB, renal Doppler should be done to find out if there is any renal parenchymal damage. Now in the postnatal period, strict blood pressure monitoring at least 4 times a day, along with input-output charting, monitoring of the urinary output, and monitoring of premonitory signs and symptoms is also very important, okay, because patients can even convulse in the postpartum period. So assessing all of this is very important. Maintaining steady levels of blood pressure is also very important. Measure the platelet count, liver transaminases, serum creatinine levels 48 hours to 72 hours after birth. So day 2 to day 3. Do not repeat if reports are normal, but if results are not normal, then repeat as clinically indicated, maybe every 2 to 3 days till the reports are normal. And if there is any widespread abnormality in any of these reports, do take a physician reference to rule out any other medical causes. Proteinuria and edema generally disappear within a week postpartum. Persistent proteinuria and persistent hypertension may be due to underlying chronic conditions and require medical review. Patient should be discharged only once the BP has normalized and has stabilized to less than 140/90. It should be a stable blood pressure, not a single reading. Over 2 to 3 days, the blood pressure should be maintained at constant levels of less than 140/90. Blood tests, proteinuria are within normal limits, along with clinical improvement of the patient. When all this is present, you can discharge the patient safely. Coming to breastfeeding, so antihypertensive medications can pass into breast milk, yes, but most of these, when taken while breastfeeding, lead only to very low levels in the breast milk, and they are unlikely to have any clinical effect on the baby. So it is safe to give antihypertensive medications during breastfeeding or in patients who are breastfeeding. Consider monitoring the blood pressure of babies, especially those born preterm who have symptoms of low blood pressure for the first few weeks. When discharged home, advise women to monitor their babies for drowsiness, lethargy, pallor, cold peripheries, or poor feeding. Any of these features are present, ask her to follow up either with you or with the pediatrician immediately. Okay, so these are again the nice recommendations. So with that, we come to the end of the lecture. Just a brief take-home message from today's lecture. Management of preeclampsia depends on disease severity and gestational age. So your clinical acumen is very important here. Antihypertensives should be started in severe hypertension, blood pressure more than or equal to 160/110. Vaginal delivery is the preferred mode of delivery in preeclampsia-eclampsia patients. Convulsions in a pregnant patient should be considered eclampsia unless proven otherwise. Delivery is the definitive management of eclampsia. Magnesium sulfate is the drug of choice for prevention and treatment of eclampsia. It is not to be used as an antihypertensive agent though. Good antepartum care in these patients is the key to optimal maternal and fetal outcome. Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of a very important topic with respect to obstetrics, that is pregnancy-induced hypertension. Thank you very much everyone for your patient listening. Before we take on the questions, just a small announcement. The next video is up on YouTube, the lecture video on postpartum hemorrhage, the first part. So do subscribe to my channel, and if you have missed that particular lecture, you can go and revisit it.